The general's voice cut through the laughter like a plasma sword through a birthday cake, precise, unexpected, and guaranteed to ruin everyone's good time. Attention. The single word carried enough authority to make several small gravitational anomalies in the vicinity straighten up and pay attention. The crowd's laughter died so quickly it could have been surgically removed. Even the ambient station noise seemed to hush, as though the universe itself had been called to order by a superior officer. Blightmore spun around with the fluid grace of someone whose spine had just been replaced with crystallized surprise. His metals jangled together in a symphony of nervous metal, creating a sound like wind chimes during an earthquake. General Stormbridge. Sir. I didn't realize you were. Commander, the general's voice contained enough ice to freeze a small moon. Step away from that woman. Immediately. The crowd began to shift nervously, sensing that their entertainment had suddenly transformed into something significantly more complex. The Ferengi entrepreneur quietly deleted his commemorative holophoto files, recognizing that profit margins had just become dangerously negative. Blightmore's face cycled through several expressions before settling on confused compliance. Sir, we were just having a bit of fun with this vagrant. Colonel Zara Thelvek, the general said, his voice carrying across the now silent crowd with the clarity of a ship's announcement system, is not a vagrant. The silence that followed was so complete it could have been bottled and sold as a luxury product. Even the station's background hum seemed to hold its breath. Colonel. Lieutenant Fenwick's voice cracked like an adolescent asteroid hitting puberty. General Stormbridge's eyes remained fixed on the small patch barely visible on Zara's jacket. Colonel Thelvek is a decorated officer of the Void Runners, a unit whose existence is classified at levels that require security clearance just to think about them incorrectly. A betazoid in the crowd made a small choking sound. The Vulcan merchant's eyebrow achieved heights previously thought to violate physics. Someone in the back whispered, "The Void Runners are real." The jacket, the general continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone explaining quantum physics to children, is not a fashion disaster. It's a service record. Every hole, every tear, every stain represents missions conducted in environments where conventional uniforms disintegrate on contact with reality. Blightmore's face had achieved a color that would have made ripe tomatoes file complaints for trademark infringement. Sir, I had no idea, she didn't identify herself. Colonel Thelvek operates under deep cover protocols, the general explained with the patience of someone addressing a class of particularly slow students. Her mission status is classified. Her service record is classified. The fact that she's standing here alive after 17-dimensional combat operations is classified. Even her coffee preferences are probably classified. Zara finally spoke, her voice carrying the dry amusement of someone watching cosmic irony unfold in real time. Actually, my coffee preferences are declassified. I take it black with a splash of temporal displacement for flavor. This comment triggered nervous laughter from the crowd, the kind of laughter that happens when people aren't sure whether they're supposed to be amused or terrified. The general's aide had recovered his datapad and was frantically accessing classified databases with the speed of someone whose career depended on immediate information retrieval. Sir, Colonel Thelvek's service record shows, oh my stars, 43 commendations, 12 classified medals, and, is this right? She's rated for combat operations in 17 different dimensions. 18, Zara corrected mildly. But the last one was more of a diplomatic mission. I only had to destroy one timeline. The crowd was now staring at her with the fascination of tourists observing a particularly dangerous exhibit at a xenobiology zoo. The same beings who had been mocking her jacket 10 minutes earlier were now trying to calculate safe distances from someone who casually mentioned timeline destruction. Blightmore appeared to be experiencing some form of existential crisis. His mouth opened and closed like a fish trying to breathe in space, while his brain attempted to process the fact that he had been humiliating someone who could probably defeat him using only her shoelaces and a mild sense of annoyance. Colonel, the general said, his tone shifting to one of professional respect, I apologize for the misunderstanding. Are you on assignment? Not exactly, Zara replied, touching the patch on her chest with unconscious familiarity. I'm between missions. The last one involved preventing a cosmic entity from using the universe as its personal chew toy. Took about 3 years, subjective time. I'm currently seeking employment while waiting for my next assignment. Employment? The general's voice suggested that the concept of a void runner seeking civilian work was roughly equivalent to discovering that black holes had taken up interior decorating as a hobby. What kind of employment? Anything that pays, she said with the practical honesty of someone whose last paycheck had been classified along with everything else about her service. I've been offered positions in waste management, professional intimidation, and agricultural pest control. The crowd was beginning to appreciate the cosmic humor of the situation. Here was someone whose resume apparently included saving the universe on multiple occasions, and she was considering a career in scaring space crows. The patch, said the Vulcan merchant, his logical mind finally processing the implications, is nearly invisible. How did you recognize it, General? General Stormbridge's hand moved to his own chest, pressing against his uniform. Because I carry a similar one. The Void Runners report directly to High Command. I've been waiting 3 years for Colonel Thelvek to return from her last mission. 3 years? Zara looked surprised. It felt like 3 weeks to me. Temporal displacement can be tricky that way. Lieutenant Fenwick was now staring at Blightmore with the expression of someone watching a traffic accident involving multiple gravitational anomalies. Sir, you criticized a Void Runner's uniform. You called her a vagrant. You suggested she needed fashion education. Blightmore's voice emerged as a squeak. I mean, how was I supposed to know? That, Zara said with gentle amusement, is rather the point of deep cover. The general turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to managing complex situations involving multiple species and dimensional rifts. What you have witnessed here is classified. The details of this encounter, Colonel Thelvek's identity, and the existence of the Void Runners are not subjects for casual conversation. What about the holophotos? Asked the Ferengi entrepreneur hopefully. Deleted, the general replied with finality. Along with any recordings, social media posts, or dinner party anecdotes. The crowd began to disperse with the reluctant efficiency of beings who had witnessed something incredible and were now forbidden from talking about it. This was the kind of cosmic irony that the universe specialized in, providing the best stories that could never be told. Blightmore approached Zara with the tentative movements of someone apologizing to a potentially active explosive device. Colonel, my sincere apologies. If I had known. Commander, Zara interrupted gently, if you had known, I wouldn't have been doing my job properly. Deep cover means even other military personnel don't recognize you. It's rather the point. But the jacket has been through 17 dimensions, for temporal anomalies, and a brief encounter with a being made of pure mathematics. It's held up remarkably well, considering. The general stepped forward, his expression mixing professional respect with obvious relief. Colonel, I have a proposition. High Command has been looking for someone with your qualifications for a new project. Interested in returning to active duty? Zara considered this, her fingers tracing the patch one final time. What kind of project? The kind that requires someone who can destroy timelines diplomatically. Does it pay better than agricultural pest control? Significantly. Then I accept. The remaining crowd watched as 2 of the galaxy's most classified military personnel conducted what appeared to be a routine employment negotiation while discussing timeline destruction as though it were a standard job requirement. The universe's sense of humor was operating at peak efficiency. The Aldebarian food vendor, who had been observing the entire proceedings with the fascination of someone watching history unfold in his lunch counter, finally spoke up. So, does anyone still want the quantum noodles? Because they're getting cold in 17 different dimensions simultaneously. This triggered the first genuine laughter the crowd had shared since the general's arrival, the kind of laughter that comes from cosmic relief and the recognition that sometimes the universe's jokes are too big to understand completely. Zara turned to leave with the general, then paused and looked back at the crowd. For what it's worth, the jacket really is incredibly ugly. You weren't wrong about that. And with that admission, she walked away to save the universe again, leaving behind a crowd of beings who would spend the rest of their lives trying to figure out whether they had just witnessed the most classified comedy routine in galactic history. The laughter reached such a crescendo that it began attracting attention from 3 levels up, where a maintenance crew working on the atmospheric processors paused their work to peer down at whatever was causing the commotion. The sound echoed through the station's corridors like a wave of cosmic hilarity, bouncing off bulkheads and reverberating through ventilation shafts until even the automated systems seemed to be chuckling along. "I think," announced a Betazoid trader whose telepathic abilities gave him insight into the crowd's collective amusement, "this is the most entertainment this sector has seen since that incident with the singing black hole last month." Blightmore was practically glowing with satisfaction, basking in the attention like a solar panel in direct starlight. His metals caught the light with each gesture, creating tiny rainbows that danced across nearby walls and occasionally blinded passing pedestrians. "You know what we should do? We should take a holographic record of this ensemble and submit it to the Galactic Fashion Council as evidence that some beings have absolutely no understanding of appropriate public attire." "Sir," Lieutenant Fenwick said, his confidence growing with the crowd's approval, "I think they'd classify it as a crime against aesthetics. Possibly with intent to cause psychological trauma to innocent bystanders." A Vulcan merchant, whose species was renowned for their logical approach to most situations, raised an eyebrow in an expression that suggested he was calculating the mathematical probability of someone voluntarily wearing such a garment. "Fascinating. The statistical likelihood of achieving this level of clothing deterioration through normal wear suggests either exceptional longevity or exposure to environments that violate several known laws of physics. Maybe it's performance art," suggested a young Betazoid student whose purple hair matched her species' traditional color preferences. "You know, a statement about the impermanence of material possessions in an ever-expanding universe." "If that's art," called out someone from the back of the crowd, "then I'm a Klingon opera singer." "Please don't give us a demonstration," another voice replied, triggering fresh waves of laughter. The crowd had grown to include beings from at least a dozen different species, creating a small amphitheater of amusement around Zara's position. A few enterprising vendors had begun selling refreshments to the spectators, recognizing a profitable entertainment opportunity when they saw one. The Aldebarian food vendor was doing particularly well with his quantum noodles, which apparently tasted even better when consumed while watching cosmic comedy unfold. Zara remained standing in the center of it all with the patience of someone who had learned that the universe's sense of timing was both impeccable and merciless. Her fingers continued their unconscious tracing of the patch on her chest, a gesture so subtle and automatic that even the most observant members of the crowd failed to notice it. "The real question," Blightmore continued, warming to his theme like a plasma furnace reaching optimal temperature, "is whether that jacket poses a structural hazard to the station. I mean, if a piece of fabric can deteriorate to that extent while someone's wearing it, what does that suggest about the environment it's been exposed to?" "Maybe she's radioactive," Lieutenant Fenwick suggested with the enthusiasm of someone who had just solved a particularly challenging puzzle. "That would explain the deterioration pattern." "Oh, wonderful," muttered a nearby Centaurian dock worker. "Now I'm worried about contamination. Should we be maintaining a safe distance?" "If she's radioactive," said the Vulcan merchant, "the radiation levels would need to be extraordinary to cause that degree of material breakdown. We would all be showing symptoms by now." "Maybe we are," announced the Betazoid student dramatically. "Maybe the symptoms include uncontrollable laughter and poor decision-making. That would explain why I signed up for advanced quantum literature this semester." The crowd's amusement reached new heights. Someone started a betting pool on how many more holes would appear in the jacket during the course of the conversation. A Ferengi entrepreneur began taking orders for commemorative holophotos, promising to capture the galaxy's most infamous fashion disaster for posterity. It was precisely at this moment of peak hilarity that the universe decided to demonstrate its flair for dramatic timing. General Corin Stormbridge appeared at the edge of the crowd like a force of nature that had learned to walk upright and carry military authorization. His presence was the kind that made nearby gravitational fields sit up and pay attention, not because of any physical imposing nature, but because of the way he moved through space as though the universe owed him personal favors and was generally prompt about paying them back. Initially, he appeared to be just another station visitor drawn by the commotion, his expression carrying the mild irritation of someone whose schedule had been disrupted by civilian nonsense. The general's uniform was a study in understated authority, perfectly pressed, appropriately decorated, but without the excessive ornamentation that marked officers who confused quantity with quality. His medals were earned rather than awarded for creative interpretations of military regulations. "What's the situation here?" he asked his aide, a sharp-eyed lieutenant colonel whose job involved keeping track of details that might be important later and people who might need to be court-martialed for stupidity. "Sir, it appears to be some kind of spontaneous entertainment event," the aide replied, consulting his datapad with the efficiency of someone who had learned to summarize chaos for busy superiors. "Commander Blightmore seems to be providing commentary on civilian fashion choices." The general's expression suggested that this was exactly the kind of thing he'd hoped to avoid during his brief station layover. His eyes swept the crowd with the systematic thoroughness of someone scanning for potential security threats, hostile aliens, or officers who were about to do something that would require paperwork to explain. It was during this visual sweep that his gaze fell upon Zara. More specifically, it fell upon her jacket. Even more specifically, it fell upon the small, nearly invisible patch sewn into the fabric just over her left breast. The change in the general's expression was subtle at first, a slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in his posture. Then it became more pronounced, like watching a statue discover it could move and wasn't entirely happy about the implications. His aide, trained to notice when his superior's attention focused on something with unusual intensity, followed the general's gaze. "Sir. Is there something?" The aide's question trailed off as his own eyes found the patch. His datapad slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the deck with the sound of expensive electronics meeting reality at high velocity. The crowd, still focused on their impromptu comedy show, remained oblivious to the drama unfolding at their periphery. Blightmore was building toward what he clearly considered his comedic masterpiece, gesturing grandly at Zara's appearance while his audience appreciated his wit with the enthusiasm of beings who had found unexpected entertainment during their routine station business. "And another thing," Blightmore declared, pointing at a particularly prominent hole in the jacket's sleeve, "that tier is so perfectly positioned that it almost looks intentional. Like someone designed it for optimal air circulation. Perhaps it's the latest in military fashion, tactical ventilation systems built right into the uniform." The crowd erupted again. Someone suggested that all military uniforms should include similar features for improved comfort during long campaigns. Another voice recommended that the jacket be studied by engineering teams looking to improve spacesuit design. General Stormbridge's face had drained of color with the efficiency of a hull breach venting atmosphere into space. His hand moved unconsciously to his own chest, pressing against a spot where, beneath layers of distinguished uniform fabric, a similar patch rested in a place of honor. The patch that marked membership in a unit so classified that most military personnel weren't cleared to know it existed. His aide was experiencing his own crisis of recognition, staring at Zara with the expression of someone who had just realized they were witnessing something impossible. The patch on her jacket was so faded, so worn, that it was nearly invisible, just a slightly darker smudge against the fabric. But the symbol was unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. The Void Runner's patch. A unit that officially didn't exist. A unit whose members operated in the spaces between dimensions, handling threats so dangerous that their mere existence was classified beyond top secret. A unit whose members were listed as casualties in public records while continuing to serve in shadows so deep that light itself required security clearance to enter. The general's lips moved soundlessly, forming words that his military training told him he shouldn't say in public, while his eyes confirmed what his mind was struggling to accept. The woman being mocked by this crowd wasn't some vagrant or eccentric civilian. She was one of his. The crowd's laughter continued, blissfully unaware that their entertainment had just become exponentially more complex. Blightmore reached the crescendo of his performance, spreading his arms wide to encompass Zara's entire appearance. "Ladies, gentlemen, and various non-binary entities," he announced with the flourish of someone unveiling a masterpiece, "I present to you what may be the galaxy's most compelling argument for mandatory fashion education in all civilized systems." The applause was enthusiastic. Several beings wiped tears of laughter from their various optical organs. The Ferengi entrepreneur was already calculating profits from his commemorative holophoto business. General Stormbridge stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, watching a decorated war hero being humiliated by beings who wouldn't survive 5 minutes in the kind of operations she had spent years conducting. His aide stood beside him, equally paralyzed by the recognition of what they were witnessing. The universe, with its characteristic sense of timing, was about to deliver a punchline that nobody would see coming. Zara had made it approximately 12 meters further into the station when the universe decided her day hadn't been entertaining enough yet. She was examining a food vendor's offerings, something called quantum noodles, that supposedly existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously until observed, at which point they collapsed into whatever flavor the customer most needed, when she felt rather than saw the approaching commotion. Commander Vex Blightmore moved through crowds the way a parade float moves through narrow streets, with unnecessary fanfare, considerable disruption, and the absolute certainty that everyone should be paying attention. His uniform was a masterpiece of military overcompensation, featuring enough medals, ribbons, and decorative elements to stock a small jewelry store. Each medal caught the station's artificial lighting and reflected it with the enthusiasm of a disco ball having an identity crisis. Behind him trailed an entourage of junior officers whose primary qualification appeared to be their ability to nod enthusiastically at everything their commander said, regardless of whether it made sense, violated physics, or contradicted something he'd said 5 minutes earlier. They moved in a formation that suggested careful choreography, if the choreographer had been trained by someone whose only experience with dance involved watching explosions from a safe distance. The food vendor, a 6-armed Aldebaran whose species had evolved specifically for the demands of multitasking in food service, immediately straightened all 6 spines when he spotted Blightmore's approach. His arms began moving in synchronized patterns that would have impressed a conductor, quickly arranging his wares into more aesthetically pleasing formations while simultaneously calculating how much he could overcharge for the privilege of serving military personnel. Zara, focused on determining whether quantum noodles were worth the risk of accidentally eating herself in a parallel universe, stepped backward to get a better view of the menu. This brought her directly into contact with Commander Blightmore's left elbow, which had been gesturing expansively about some tactical brilliance he'd supposedly demonstrated during a training exercise that existed primarily in his imagination. The collision was minor by any reasonable standard, barely enough force to disturb a soap bubble, but Blightmore reacted as though he'd been struck by a meteorite with personal vendetta issues. He spun around with the dramatic flair of someone whose military career had been heavily influenced by bad holodrama productions, his medals jangling together like an orchestra of tiny cymbals having a disagreement. "What in the 7 spiral galaxies," he began, then stopped abruptly when his eyes took in Zara's appearance. His expression shifted through several distinct phases. Initial outrage, confused assessment, and then settling into the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters or avant-garde art installations. "Sir," one of his subordinates said, stepping forward with the protective instincts of someone whose job security depended on deflecting any criticism away from his commander, "this civilian appears to have bumped into you." "Appears?" Blightmore's voice climbed several octaves, threatening to reach frequencies that could shatter crystalline life forms. "Lieutenant Fenwick, I believe my elbow can confirm that this person definitely made contact." Zara looked up at him with the expression of someone who had learned that the best response to unreasonable authority was polite bewilderment. "I apologize, Commander. I was examining the menu and didn't see you approaching." "The menu?" Blightmore's voice suggested that examining menus was possibly treasonous. "You were so engrossed in reading about, what exactly?" He squinted at the vendor's display. "Quantum noodles. You're telling me you nearly assaulted a military officer because you were contemplating theoretical pasta?" "The assault seems to have been mutual," Zara replied mildly. And I believe the noodles are more metaphysical than theoretical. This comment caused Lieutenant Fenwick to choke slightly on whatever he'd been about to say. The other members of Blightmore's entourage exchanged glances that suggested they were witnessing something unprecedented, someone talking back to their commander without immediately apologizing for existing. Blightmore's face began cycling through colors like a mood ring experiencing technical difficulties. Are you actually, do you have any idea who you're speaking to? Someone with impressive taste in decorative metals, Zara said, gesturing vaguely at his metal collection. Although I'm curious about the purple one. Is that for exceptional services to accessorizing? A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the spectacle of military authority meeting civilian indifference. The food vendor's 6 arms continued their work, but his primary eyes were fixed on the unfolding drama with the intensity of someone watching a particularly explosive sporting event. That purple ribbon, Blightmore said, his voice dripping with wounded dignity, represents my commendation for excellence in strategic logistics during the Nebula 7 supply crisis. Ah, Zara nodded thoughtfully. And what did that involve, exactly? I successfully coordinated the delivery of essential supplies to 17 forward bases despite challenging circumstances and limited resources. By challenging circumstances, do you mean the supplies that were accidentally shipped to the wrong galaxy and took 6 months to redirect? The crowd's interest level jumped several notches. Lieutenant Fenwick made a sound like a small animal being stepped on. One of the other officers began studying his boots with the intensity of an archaeologist examining ancient artifacts. Blightmore's face had settled on a shade of red that would have made traffic signals jealous. How could you possibly know about, that information is classified? Really? Zara's expression was one of innocent curiosity. Because I heard about it at a bar on Rigel Station. Apparently it's become quite the cautionary tale in logistics circles. Something about ordering thermal underwear for a desert campaign and winter coats for troops stationed near a star. The crowd was no longer just watching, they were actively listening. Several beings had begun recording the exchange on their personal devices, recognizing the entertainment value of watching someone systematically deflate a pompous military officer using only polite conversation and inconvenient facts. Blightmore sputtered, his carefully maintained military bearing beginning to crack like cheap armor under stress. Do you have any idea what kind of complex calculations and strategic thinking went into that operation? I imagine it involved a lot of explaining afterward, Zara said sympathetically. Lieutenant Fenwick finally found his voice, though it came out roughly 2 octaves higher than normal. Sir, perhaps we should. No. Blightmore's voice carried enough authority to make several small creatures in the vicinity seek cover. I want to know exactly who this person thinks she is, questioning military operations and, he stopped mid-sentence, his attention finally focusing on Zara's appearance rather than her words. And wearing, what in the name of all known physics is that supposed to be? His gaze had locked onto her jacket with the horrified fascination of someone discovering a new form of matter that violated several fundamental laws. The crowd followed his stare, and suddenly every eye in the immediate vicinity was examining Zara's well-worn garment with renewed interest. It's a jacket, she replied, as though this should be obvious. That's not a jacket, announced one of Blightmore's officers, a young ensign whose confidence far exceeded his experience. That's archaeological evidence. I think it predates faster-than-light travel. The crowd erupted in laughter. Someone in the back shouted, maybe it's from before the invention of fabric. Look at those holes, another voice called out. I count 17. No, wait, 18. That one just appeared while I was watching. Blightmore seemed to have found his second wind, powered by the crowd's attention and his own sense of superiority. Honestly, allowing people dressed like refugees from a textile disaster to wander around public areas. What's next, letting people wear actual garbage bags as formal wear? At least garbage bags are waterproof, Lieutenant Fenwick added, apparently deciding that joining the mockery was safer than remaining neutral. And they come in fashionable colors, another officer chimed in. Black, white, sometimes even clear for special occasions. The jokes were flying now like photon torpedoes in a space battle. Maybe she's making a statement about sustainability, wearing clothes until they achieve sentience and ask to be retired. I think something's actually living in those holes. Is that ethical? Should we call animal control? Someone should start a charity. Jackets for the jacketless, because everyone deserves sleeves. Zara stood in the center of the growing circle of mockery like a lighthouse in a storm of ridicule, her expression maintaining the kind of calm that comes from having faced significantly worse opposition under considerably more dangerous circumstances. Her hand drifted unconsciously to the small patch on her chest, fingers tracing its nearly invisible outline with the automatic gesture of someone touching a talisman. The crowd was really warming to the theme now. Suggestions for jacket improvements came from all directions. Maybe she could get patches made from actual spacetime fabric, at least then the holes would lead somewhere interesting. I hear there's a museum of fashion disasters on Centauri Prime, they'd probably pay good money for that exhibit. Has anyone checked to see if there's actually a person under all that damage, or is this just an animated pile of fabric scraps? Blightmore was basking in the attention like a solar collector in direct starlight. You know what the real tragedy is here? This person probably spent actual credits on that garment. Somewhere in the galaxy, there's a merchant who managed to sell what appears to be the aftermath of a textile explosion, and they're probably still laughing about it. Maybe it's vintage, suggested the Aldebaran food vendor, apparently deciding that participating in the entertainment was good for business. You know, from back when they didn't know how to make clothes that stayed in one piece. Vintage? Blightmore's voice carried all the authority of someone who had found the perfect target for his wit. That's not vintage, that's archaeological. That jacket probably remembers when this station was still an asteroid field with ambitions. The transport shuttle's landing thrusters kicked up enough cosmic dust to choke a Venusian sandworm, and Zara Thelvek stepped off the boarding ramp into what could generously be called organized chaos. The intergalactic trade station buzzed with the kind of energy that only comes from throwing together beings from 47 different star systems and expecting them to conduct business without starting any interplanetary incidents. So far today, the count was only at 3 minor diplomatic crises and 1 accidentally declared war that had been resolved with a firm handshake and some really good imported chocolate. Zara pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing, if breathing were something she still needed to think about. The jacket had seen better decades, possibly better centuries, and those decades had not been kind. What might have once been a respectable shade of military green now resembled the color of pond scum from a particularly unwell pond. The fabric bore more holes than a conspiracy theory convention, and the patches that covered some of those holes looked like they'd been applied by someone using their feet while blindfolded during a gravitational storm. The first merchant she approached, a blob-like Zephyrian whose skin shifted colors like a mood ring having an identity crisis, took one look at her and immediately developed a pressing need to reorganize his inventory of impossible geometries. His eye stalks swiveled everywhere except in her direction as he muttered something about being closed for dimensional maintenance, despite the fact that 3 other customers were currently examining his wares with the intensity of art critics at a museum opening. Zara moved on with the resigned patience of someone who had learned that the universe's sense of humor operated on a cosmic scale and usually at her expense. The next stall sold what appeared to be musical instruments, though from a species whose concept of harmony involved sounds that could liquefy most known metals. The vendor, whose head resembled a crystalline flower that had been through a blender, actually looked up when she approached, which Zara counted as progress. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the slight musical undertone that marked her as Thelvakan, "I'm looking for work. I have experience in logistics, security, and conflict resolution." The crystal-headed vendor's petals tinkled like wind chimes in a hurricane as he examined her appearance. His expression, insofar as a being made of living crystal could have expressions, suggested he was trying to solve a particularly challenging equation and kept getting the wrong answer. "Security?" he asked, his voice sounding like someone had taught a xylophone to speak. "What kind of security experience?" "The kind that keeps things from falling apart," Zara replied, which was technically accurate while being spectacularly unhelpful. The vendor's petals rearranged themselves into what might have been skepticism. Right. And I suppose that jacket is part of your security equipment? It serves its purpose. Which is what? Scaring away fashion-conscious criminals. A few nearby shoppers had begun to gather, drawn by the conversation like spectators to a traffic accident. One of them, a sleek Arcturian whose blue skin gleamed like polished metal, snickered audibly. Maybe she's undercover as a homeless vagrant. Very deep cover. This triggered a ripple of laughter from the growing crowd. A Rigelian with more arms than common sense pointed at the jacket's most prominent hole and announced, "I can see space through that tear." Actual space. That's not a jacket, that's a window with sleeves. More laughter. Zara stood in the center of it like a small island of dignity in an ocean of cosmic ridicule. She'd been through worse, much worse, but that didn't make the sting any less sharp. The irony was thick enough to mine for rare minerals. Here she stood, being mocked by beings who wouldn't last 30 seconds in the kind of situations her jacket had seen her through, and she couldn't say a word about it without violating approximately 14 different classified information protocols. A young human in what was obviously his first off-world assignment approached with the swagger of someone who had read exactly one book about interspecies relations and considered himself an expert. "Hey, lady, did you fish that jacket out of a black hole? Because it looks like it's been stretched across an event horizon." The crowd was really warming up now. Suggestions for jacket improvements flew like photon torpedoes. Maybe she could get it bronzed and donated to a museum of fashion disasters. "I bet it glows in the dark, not on purpose, just from all the radiation it's absorbed. Someone should put that thing out of its misery." Zara touched the spot over her left breast where a small, barely visible patch was sewn into the fabric. The patch was so faded that it was nearly invisible, just a slightly darker smudge against the already dark staining of the jacket. Her six-fingered hand traced its edges with unconscious familiarity, a gesture so subtle that none of the laughing crowd noticed it. "Look," said a Centaurian dock worker whose 4 legs gave him the authority of someone who literally had a leg to stand on, "no offense, but you might want to try the lower levels. There's always work in waste management, and frankly, your wardrobe is already perfectly suited for the environment." This triggered another wave of laughter. Someone in the back called out, she could get a job as a scarecrow on one of the agricultural moons. Probably scare away pests from 3 systems over. Zara's luminescent purple eyes, one of the few things about her that remained undeniably beautiful despite her current circumstances, swept across the crowd with the kind of patience that comes from having stared down beings whose names existed only in classified files. These merchants and travelers had no idea that the woman they were mocking had once held the line against forces that could have turned their comfortable little lives into cosmic footnotes. The crystal vendor finally spoke up again, apparently feeling generous. "Tell you what, I'll give you some advice for free. There's a clothing dispensary on level 7. Basic uniforms, worker coveralls, that sort of thing. Might want to visit there before your next job interview." "Very thoughtful," Zara replied, her voice carrying just enough dry amusement to suggest that she was in on the joke, even if the joke was largely at her expense. "Just trying to help," the vendor said, though his twinkling petals suggested he was enjoying the entertainment value more than any charitable impulse. A small Ferengi-adjacent trader who had been counting profits in the corner looked up from his calculations. "Actually, there might be something. I need someone to stand outside my stall and, well, scare away the competition. You know, look threatening." The crowd erupted again. "Perfect job match. She won't even need a costume. Just stand there and exist menacingly." Zara considered the offer with the seriousness of someone evaluating a tactical position. "What would that pay?" "Room and board. Maybe some credits if business picks up." "Room and board where?" "Storage compartment. It's cozy." "Well, it's a compartment." The absurdity of the situation was reaching levels that would have impressed even the universe's most dedicated comedians. Here she was, a decorated officer whose service record was so classified it required security clearance just to think about it, being offered a job as a professional intimidator by someone whose idea of threatening involved her merely existing in public. "I'll consider it," she said, which was true. She would consider it, reject it, and then consider how her life had reached the point where scaring away competition for a Ferengi knockoff was a viable career option. The crowd began to disperse, having extracted maximum entertainment value from the encounter. As they moved away, she could hear fragments of conversation. "Did you see that jacket? I've seen military surplus, but that was military extinct. Poor thing, probably doesn't have 2 credits to rub together." If only they knew, Zara thought, touching the patch again. If only they had any idea what those credits had purchased, what battles had been fought, what victories had been won while wearing this exact jacket. But that was the point, wasn't it? The most effective soldiers were the ones nobody talked about, the ones who operated in the spaces between spaces, handling the problems too dangerous for the public to even know they existed. She walked deeper into the station, past vendors selling impossible technologies and foods that defied several laws of physics. Her stomach reminded her that even heroes needed to eat, and heroes with empty credit accounts needed to eat cheaply. The universal constant of hunger was one of the few things that remained consistent across all known species and dimensions. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was probably the most qualified person on this entire station for any security position worth having, and yet she couldn't get hired to guard a flower stand. The universe, she had learned long ago, had a sense of humor that operated on scales both cosmic and deeply personal, and it seemed particularly fond of jokes that took years to set up and delivered punchlines that only the target would understand.